All right. Okay, guys, grab a seat. I think it's going. Bugs, go sit down.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Library Hall. I don't usually use the microphone. It's kind of nice, actually. So this is a really special evening. This is a partnership between the Bud Warner Library and Exploring the Sacred, two organizations that are continuously doing all kinds of interesting programs out in the community. And this is the first time that we've had a chance to collaborate on something. And the reason we're collaborating is because right now we're in the middle of our One Book Steamboat Community Read. This is the first time we've ever done one in the winter time. And the reason we are doing it in the winter this year is because we are reading Inheritance by Dani Shapiro. And it is a memoir that actually came out in paperback on January 28th. And because the idea of a community read is that we really want books to be accessible and have lots and lots of copies of them here in the library for people to check out, we kind of pushed everything back to coincide with the release of the paperback. It's been a New York Times bestseller over the entire last year. And we have been doing an entire month of programming surrounding the book. And then on March 11th, Dani Shapiro will be here in Steamboat. Yes, very big night for Steamboat. We're really, really excited. We had an amazing film documentary last week, kind of looking at, it was called, what am I? Data Mining the Deceased, sorry. With the filmmaker really delving deep into some of those privacy issues that have to do with when you spit in the cup and send your DNA off. I'm slightly terrified now. Really wishing I hadn't done that maybe. And next week we do have a documentary, Decoding Watson, looking at the scientists to whom we can give credit for much of what we have going on now with people digging up their genetic history. So tonight, we're on spirituality and identity, and I promised I would give a quick synopsis of Dani Shapiro's book, which, if you haven't read it, is anybody here reading it or already read it?
I read it.
Yeah? So a good smattering. For those who haven't, here's the story. Dani Shapiro was 50 years old, and she grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home, in Brooklyn, very much knew who she was, where she came from, who her family was, who and how she identified in this world. She was 50 years old. She randomly took a spit in the cup DNA test. It came back, and she got a very different result than anything she ever imagined. She, of course, assumed it was wrong. There is no possible way, but it was not wrong. She had I don't want to do a complete spoiler here because there are many layers to kind of what she went through, but it turns out that she was a product of a sperm donor, and this had never been divulged to her in her life, and her father was much more Scandinavian Methodist than Brooklyn Jewish, where she had grown up. Presbyterian, thank you. So there are tons of conversations in this book to be had, obviously about what is family, who you are spiritually, what counts for you, what doesn't count for you, where you draw the line on privacy. Was it her right to know? Was it her biological father? Did he have further rights to privacy? It kind of goes on and on and on. And we are really, really honored to have Exploring the Sacred here to lead this conversation tonight and take us down these paths. A huge thanks to all of you. I had this really fortunate opportunity to pop in on one of their lunchtime gatherings when they were just really tossing ideas out there and debating. They have been having this debate for many months already, so they're now bringing it to you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marshall. And thanks for coming out tonight.
So thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Marshall McCarthy, and my husband and I started exploring the sacred a little over 15 years ago now. For those of you maybe who haven't been to one of our events, Exploring the Sacred is a group of religious leaders in Steamboat, and we meet about once a month and have lots of discussions about topics that are spiritual, political, what's going on in the world, and then we offer these panel discussions probably 3 or 4 times a year. And so we were really honored when Jenny asked us to do this collaboration with the library based on this book. And just so you know, if you didn't read the book, that's okay. You don't have to have read the book. We're hoping tonight's conversation can just be about, in general, what does identity mean? And more specifically, what we'll be focusing on, because it's a panel of religious leaders, is spiritual identity. And what does spiritual identity mean to us? How does it shape who we are? Where do we get it from? Is it something that comes from the outside or something that comes from the inside? Does it change over time? How does it influence our lives? So these are some of the questions that we'll be addressing today. There are pamphlets in the back, if you didn't get one on your way in, that just have more information about the group. If you're interested in having contact information or bios on any of the leaders, that's also in the pamphlets in the back. So I'd like to start just by having the leaders introduce themselves, the congregation that you're from, and your names.
I'm Larry Klingman. I belong to Har Mishpacha, the Jewish congregation of Steamboat Springs. I am a lay person. I'm not a rabbi. Let's leave it at that.
I'm Ernest Baer. I'm the pastor of Holy Name Catholic Church.
I'm Steve Begner. I'm a Muslim. I've been one for 45 years, and we worship at the Heart of Steamboat United Methodist Church on Fridays, and we worshiped at other places for the last 10 years. There's about between 25 and 35 of us at any given service, which is generally on Fridays, just after lunch.
I'm Karen Post, and I lead the local Course in Miracles group that I've been leading now for 33 years.
I'm Tim Olmsted. I'm the founder of the Buddhist community here in town. And we're young, just 25 years old.
So we'll start with the first question, and anyone can jump in on this. And the first question is, how does our identity form? Does it come from our genes, from our culture, from our families? Is it something we decide ourselves? But how do we form our identity?
You mean general or spiritual?
You can do general for this one. We'll get into spiritual in a minute, but let's start with just generally.
I don't know about Mary, but I suspect that both of us go back to the Genesis story about creation. I have often mentioned this, but just the idea that the Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew Scriptures, talks about human beings being created in the image and likeness of God. And so that's a given identity, because we're created. This is a Christian perspective, Judeo-Christian, I suppose. We're created with this identity. That's the image and likeness of God. And we could debate all night about what is that image and likeness all about. But so that's our most basic identity, and the Catholic Church would say that that's given to us at the moment of conception, when the baby is conceived. And then the development of that person's identity is affected by culture, by society, by family, by all of our relationships, by our education, and our religion. So there's a dialectical relationship, I would say, between a person discovering their truest self and choosing who they really want to be. I think because God gives us freedom, that's one of God's images or likenesses is freedom. So if we're created free, then we can continue to choose, that. So there's a relationship between who we are and who we choose to be, because God gives us freedom to choose that as we continue to grow, as we're affected by society and relationships.
I don't fully agree with
Okay.
with you on that one. If I were to ask a person to stand up and simply tell me who you are you? You would probably, each of us would probably have a description of the type of person we are. One might say I'm a moral person. One might say I'm a giving person. One might say I'm a taking person. And if I then ask, well, how did you come to that? And that's really what I think this is about, is for each of us to think about how did we become the person that we are. So for me, at the moment of birth, I don't think anyone has a religion. I think that we're born into an environment, and that religion is learned. I don't think it comes from some outside source. I think the environment that we're born into, the place that we live, people that love us, that respect us, that we admire, that we tend to follow whatever position they're in. So that becomes kind of a social or an environmental effect on us to help us define who we are. I think we bring genetic things with us, a whole lineage of all the genes that went before us. I think it's there, but I don't really personally believe there's a religious gene. I think that that's something that's learned. And I think it changes through our lives. I think that we follow the people that we admire. We become like them. And at a certain point in our lives, we may go in a different direction. We may change. And that change may be caused by the people that are affecting us at that time. We get past our childhood, we go into teenage years, we go into our college years, and a lot more ideas and observations come to us. And I think that affects us. I think it affects us tremendously, and it helps us define who we are. Now, in that beginning phase, when we're admiring someone who has a religion or has taught us religion, we may admire that and become part of that. But I would say that most of us go through a period of time where we change and we become the individual that we're going to be. And we've been affected by that. And we've also been affected spiritually because of what we followed. So there's that element in there as well. So I think it's threefold. I think it's, I'm getting the cane.
Okay, thanks, Larry. Yeah.
When I was 5 or 6, I was read a bedtime story on a children's version of the Arabian Nights, and it was called The Sleeper Awakens. And it fascinated me because what it talked about was a man who, it was a wealthy merchant, and somebody put a sleep tonic in his wine, and he woke up in the palace of the local caliph. and everybody treated him as if he was the caliph. It was a joke that the caliph was playing on this man. And for 3 weeks, he was able to make laws, rule as if he was the caliph. And so he had woken up believing he was a wealthy merchant, but after the 3 weeks, he started to believe he was the caliph. Then the caliph put a sleeping tonic in his wine again, and he woke back up in his own household, thinking he was the caliph, and his mother was saying, no, you're just a wealthy businessman. And over time, as his friends and family treated him like a wealthy businessman, he just thought he had a wild dream about being a caliph, until the sleeping tonic was put back in his wine and he woke back up in the palace. And at which point he thought he was absolutely crazy because he couldn't figure out who he was. And then the caliph comes out from behind a curtain and tells him the joke, and they become good friends. But as a 6-year-old, what that hit me with was how much of who we are comes from outside of us, comes from the reflection from our families, our friends, our experiences. And I remember as a 6-year-old climbing up in an apple tree, because only as a 6-year-old will, I kept thinking that people's energies were attached to the earth. And if I could get way out on a branch, maybe I could get away from other people's energies and just sit there until I knew who I was, apart from whatever was reflected back to me about being a daughter or a sister or a tomboy or all of the other things, the labels I had. And I didn't know it then, but I was beginning to meditate. And I started to realize that if I really went deeply inside, there was a really consistent part of me that never, as I got older, changed or aged or anything else. And I started calling that the real Karen. And so I was aware of 2 identities, two experiences of me. One was reflected by the world around me, and one was innate inside of me. One changed, one never did.
Just from what Karen said, from a Buddhist point of view, it's very much like all of you have said, that there is a part of us that is unchanging, and it is born in the likeness of some divine of some kind, that never changes. So in some ways we could say that that's our absolute nature, that's our fundamental absolute nature. Unfortunately, we have spent so much time not being connected to it, we've lost our way back to that. We've lost immediate connection with that, which is one of the reasons why we're always so haunted. Because we have this intuition that there's a way of being that is sort of free and open and unconfined and fundamentally at peace. But yet we're out there looking for it. So I think from a Buddhist point of view, we would completely agree. There's a part of us, our fundamental nature, our pristine awareness, our Buddha nature, whatever we call it. That's the sort of absolute quality. And the rest, we would say, is a cocktail between propensities, karmic propensities, that we bring into this life with, and then the mix of how those karmic propensities play off all of our social interactions, our schooling, our friends, our family, the whole thing. And the line between those that keeps it from just being random and by chance is a kind of intentionality that is either more or less present for someone, how they want to live their life, what they want to explore, etc., etc. So I think in many ways we agree that there's this inner absolute, unchanging, and the rest is somewhat open to the winds of cause and conditions.
The inner and absolute, that's an interesting observation. When I was 26, as a Christian, I hadn't really thought deeply about the fundamentals of my faith. I, of course, went through the process and became a Christian at 12, etc. But when my mother-in-law died at 51 years of age, I couldn't explain what happened, why it happened, what will happen to her soul. And I started reading because I wasn't satisfied with what I had been taught. It wasn't enough. And for a couple years, I read deeply and widely. one thing that did stand out was a book by Thomas Merton, and he talked about wisdom, and that really made a major impact on me. So my second year of teaching as a professor, a student came up after class with a book called Divine Luminous Wisdom, and I said, I think I want to talk to you, and that was it. I learned that he was a student of a Sufi master, and there were lots of books, lots of discourses, lots of people who in the United States had been drawn to the teaching of this person, and I was one of those. So that's how I became a Muslim through Sufism, and all of our questions were answered in a very important way. I stopped drinking, I stopped smoking occasionally, became a vegetarian, and my life totally changed. Although it looked like I was just becoming a professor, from the inside out, I now understood what my life was about.
So the next question is how identity operates in our lives. Most of us have some kind of identity where we may say, we're a particular religion or race or gender or sexual orientation, that we have things that we identify ourselves as. And do you see this as something that creates separation between people, or does it create belonging for people? How does identity operate?
I think it works two different ways. I think our community, as I was saying earlier, informs us who we are, informs us about how, goals we might have for life, structure, and in that way it's supportive, but it can be limiting. That community can be like a bubble, and depending on how rigid the structure, it can sort of not prevent, but maybe restrict our access to looking at other ways of living or thinking or believing. There's a wonderful book called Collapse that talks about how important culture and community is in keeping community going, but also it can lead to collapse of the community if there is no ability to grow or be flexible with changes in society, environment, and a variety of other things. Also, an internal identity gives a lot of structure as well, and freedom. When you know who you are and you're fairly grounded in who you are, you have a lot of flexibility to move into different places because they aren't perceived as threats. You have an inner strength. But when you just rely on that inner part, when there is deep turmoil, a person can feel very lost and be wanting the community to reach out and support. So I think it can go both ways. I think there's strengths in outer community or outer identification, and there's strengths on inner ones, and there can be a weakness on both.
I'm thinking of I'll take Judaism. We'll start with Judaism. If I were raised as a Hasidic Jew in a very, very Orthodox community, if I was born into that, and that was something that I felt was part of who I was, and I changed at some point and said, I'm really uncomfortable with this, and I'm not going to do that. The community would, I'm going to go in my own direction. The community might well throw me out. And so there, an awful lot of conflict would happen at that point. I don't think it's unique just to Orthodoxy. I think it's everywhere. If we form opinions about who we are and what we believe in, and we're not comfortable enough to be open and listening to other people's beliefs, there's going to be conflict. I mean, we don't have to go very far today to see that conflict. I think when people begin to change who they think they are, they become a little bit different. The community that they're in, when they realize they can't overpower that person and get that person to stay in that community, then there becomes a lot of conflict. I don't want to give away things from the book that when one Steamboat is reading, but there is a lot of conflict in the book as she begins to realize she's something different than she thought she was. I don't know how one can make these kinds of changes and not have a great deal of conflict in their life.
You know, it seems to me that almost all of the great spiritual figures in history, and I think all of us in one way or another, have had the experience that we grow up with a certain identity, and at some point that cracks. If that doesn't break, then there's no real room for anything new and fresh. This is the proverbial dark night of the soul and the whole thing, but I think anybody on any quest, just as a human being growing up, that you first identify with your family and the outer, et cetera, and there is this quality of, as you were saying, Karen, a sort of basic sort of groundedness, but at some point, that groundedness also has to give up. That has to be broken through, and there's always a period, sometimes very, very long, of kind of bewilderment before something comes back that feels intuitively more real, more authentic, more genuine. And it might come back so slowly you don't even know it. But it always seems to me that there's a kind of certainty, total uncertainty and kind of breakdown. And then something emerges from that that's kind of beyond identity, actually. Is a different kind of identity. It's much more spacious, it's much more connected, it's much less centralized. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, that kind of brings up my next question, which is around how we choose our spirituality, or sort of what we're attracted to spiritually. Is that something, I know a number of the panel members here were raised in one faith and are now spiritual leaders in a different faith, whereas some of them have always been in the same faith. So my question is about, is our spirituality formed by our family, our culture, what we're exposed to, or do you believe that there's some sort of internal longing or karmically that we are just attracted to a particular religion or spirituality? Sort of what's the interplay of those two things?
I've not often had the kind of conversation that with other Muslims that goes into what I'm about to say. But what became clear to me almost from the start was that each of us, my belief, each of us has God within us. He's immanent, he's present, as well as transcendent. And I began to appreciate that when I thought about things and couldn't reach an understanding, and I would ask God for guidance, and give me a clue here and a clue there. I'd continue to think about it, and then I would discover what seemed to me to be the right answer. And I just want to emphasize that if we go within ourselves and look for the right answers, and try not to, while we're waiting for the answer, try not to continue to make mistakes or to continue to do, to engage in behaviors which might be not real smart. If we try not to do that and just wait for an answer to come and listen to your conscience, it will come.
Getting back to my original point, if we're created in the image and likeness of God, we could say, well, what is God? And part of our way of approaching it would be to say God is love, God is life, God is truth, God is beauty, all those wonderful virtues that we sometimes aspire to. Eternal, good. And so I would say there is that original something inside of us that longs for truth, longs for beauty, longs for love, longs for life and goodness, relationship. And so that's an original part, as I see it, in all of us, and we're longing for that. And so we look out and we learn from the society around us. Maybe we learn from the religion that's been handed to us. We study other religions and we try to figure out, I try to figure out which one fits best into that longing deep inside of me. And so as I have received the revelation of the Christian community, I see answers to those longings that are offered through that tradition. So it's sort of like a connection, like a magnet. Like there's two pieces come together and it seems to fit. And so it's both and, it's part of it inside of us, but it's also out there. And other people might find it meeting the magnet attracts to something else that fits, But it is still the same longing that I think we all have. And so for me, the Christian revelation answers those longings. And so I think it's sort of both. And then I just pursue those lifestyles and the values that are handed on to me because it seems to fit.
So would you say, Ernest, though, that longing could also be met by other traditions?
I would say so, for sure.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for me, Danny's book starts with her looking in the mirror and trying to figure out who she is, who's looking back. And I was raised in the Episcopal Church. And I remember as a small child hearing about God and saying it didn't make any sense that this all-loving God had less love than your average mother, because how could you imagine your average mother wanting to condemn a child to hell? This God I was being taught didn't make any sense to me. So it's a little bit like looking in the mirror and saying, what is that? And I had a near-death experience at 10, and then years later in the 80s was introduced to A Course in Miracles. And when I opened it up, it was like coming home. It was like, this is where I belong. In fact, some of the words in it were exactly the descriptions I tried to use when I was 10, long before anybody talked about near-death experiences. And so, yeah, for me, it's almost karmic. It's much more karmic. It was much deeper because I didn't necessarily feel at home in the religious environment I was brought up. But the minute I found A Course, I knew I was home.
Ernest, the word you use, longing, it almost seems like longing is God. God calling out to be found again or something like that. And then the rest is, one medicine doesn't cure all diseases. I don't think one approach, one religious or spiritual approach, I think it's just not possible for it to be attractive or effective for every single person. So in my case, I wanted to go into seminary and be an Episcopal priest. I had one theological problem. If I knew then what I know now, I could have gotten around that theological problem. But because you get clever and kind of like slippery. But I picked up, as many young people in those days picked up Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, and I read about the Buddha, and I was utterly transported. I mean, it was like, so clearly that was some sort of karmic thing. I've never looked back. It's been so wonderful, but it seems to me that the common for us is this longing. It seems like everybody has that somehow, and then the rest is just finding the fix in a way.
There's you know, finding these things is really an aha moment. I think most of us have had aha moments. It's when you know the middle C on the piano and middle C on the violin. It's the same middle C. And you know, I had aha moments in photography. I had aha moments in science, and I think we have aha moments in finding our faith, whatever that faith is going to be, the one that really shines or makes us shine. At that point, we have that aha moment, and that helps form who we are.
So at this point, I think we'd like to open it up to hear what questions you have around this. And as always, we're going to ask you to keep it on the topic that we're talking about tonight. If you have other questions, the leaders will stick around after. But any questions that you might have around identity, spiritual identity, questions that came up for you after reading the book, we'd love for you to come on up.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, go for it.
Larry, when you were talking about the aha moment, I think that also is something that Danny's talking about in the book. That longing to know who she is, that longing to make sense of her identity. And I think spiritually or biologically, we have that longing. I think that goes back to what you were talking about, that breaking point. In a way, that's what the book is. She broke completely open and then had to redefine herself after that complete shattering. So that made room for the longing.
The mic is yours.
Yeah, I mean, in line with the questions, that would be a case, or that opens the possibility where a sort of culturally accepted spirituality could actually be a hindrance to us, to being willing to either experience that moment in the beginning or to express it, because the culture is so tight.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna get up. I think there are a lot of very spiritual people.
I don't think people can hear, yeah.
Give me the cordless mic.
Oh, yeah, do you want to hand her the wireless?
Use the wireless.
Thanks, Jen.
I think there are a lot of spiritual people who don't identify, that I know of, who are, I would say, are very spiritual people, but they don't identify with any one organized religion.
Is that a question?
No, it's a statement. That's why I said I didn't have to go there.
Did everyone hear that?
Thank you guys for sharing. Yeah, I just have a question about, as you guys were talking about the first question, it reminded me about purpose and how identity relates to purpose in life. Like, I don't know what each of you guys thinks about that. I remember talking to someone a long time ago about evolution, and I was kind of the idea of, well, if you believe in evolution or not, doesn't really matter to me. Like, I do believe in God, and I feel like, well, he could have done it either way, potentially. But for the friend I was talking with, it took purpose away from his life, and he kind of became hopeless because he said, or had some of that tendency, because he thought that, well, we're just this mix of atoms and so on, and so we don't really have a purpose. And for him, he thought, well, that's just life, but I could see some hopelessness behind that. So anyways, I'm just wondering how...
What was it that took purpose out of his life? What was it that took purpose out of his life?
The idea of evolution for him, because he thought, well, we're just this mix of atoms
I
that
see.
come together randomly, and
The kind of materialistic view.
What?
The materialistic view of who we are. All just atoms and
yeah,
such.
yeah, just come together. So yeah, I'm just curious about how you feel identity relates to purpose. Yeah.
So are you asking, do we need I'm sorry, I'm a little confused about your question. What is the question that you're asking?
What for each of you guys, how do you see purpose? What defines purpose in life? Is there purpose in life? And how does identity relate to purpose?
That's a good question, and I would throw a question back at you. Do you think we need purpose?
I do.
All right,
I do. I feel like it gives us hope and joy and gives us all the, things we want to live for. It has to do with our heart being alive for me.
That's good. It also gives us anxiety if we don't reach our purpose. It gives us something, a goal to go after.
Just the first thing that comes to my mind from the Christian perspective is St. Paul talks about all of the members of the community being members of the one body, and namely the body of Christ. And so he talks about different body parts, the eye and the ear, the hands and the nose and the feet and the mouth. Like we all have a different role within the one body. And I think it's very affirming that to know that each of us has an important place and that we're all functioning together. So it's a call to unity, it's a call to harmony, it's a call to work together, humility, but it also is a great boost for our esteem to know that we do have an important role. And I don't know, it's maybe idealistic to think that every one of us is completely unique. Do we all really have completely unique fingerprints or eye retinas or whatever? But if we all really are completely unique, then no one else in the world can do what we can do to affect change for the better. And so I think it's important issue, and that's the Christian approach, is that we all do have a purpose, and that is namely, to make the world a better place, to advance the kingdom of God, the kingdom of peace and love and life.
From Aristotle to Maslow, this has been discussed, and Maslow talked about it at the top of the pyramid, and that's self-actualization, and that would be living out that destiny, realizing capital S self, walking your unique destiny. And so, many of us are afraid, because the problem with uniqueness is you stand out, and we are biologically social creatures, and social creatures like to blend in, because the reason we hang out in packs is that it gives safety. So Maslow talked about competing desires within us, the desire to know ourselves and to self-actualize, and the desire to not stick out and be, as one person called, the tall poppy syndrome. The tall poppy gets cut down. And so we live with that inner conflict. I think, Larry, you were talking about conflict before. And our purpose would be to know who we are and that unique thing. Now, that doesn't mean you need to be famous. You might just be the best mother you can be, or the best Christian you can be, or whatever. But that we each do have a unique contribution to make, and finding that out, going into that depth, would be our purpose.
Yeah, the idea, I agree with what you said, each of us has our own contribution. From a straight Buddhist point of view, the idea of having a purpose suggests that there's some sort of destiny. It's a theistic model, that someone has an idea for me, or a purpose for me, or there's a book somewhere, or whatever. I don't mean to make light of it, but whatever, we use the idea of purpose, it's a little bit disembodied. And I would suggest, although it's just playing with words a little bit, rather than purpose, and a way of thinking it might be, what's the opportunity that this life offers? What's possible for me in this life? And then we don't get too far ahead of ourselves. It might just be, what's possible for me is to get out of being depressed when I'm 16. That's what's possible. If we get too far ahead with some sort of grand purpose, then we're always a little bit in a foot in two boats. The boat of who I really am and really like being there, and some fantasy boat in the future, which I think is something that traps a lot of people on the spiritual path. It certainly did me for many years. So I always think of what's possible. What is this human life? What's the opportunity that gives me?
When the first things I learned was that we have different levels of consciousness, and everyone has feeling, awareness, and intellect. But above intellect, one needs to at least ponder about things and wonder what's going on. And you kind of have to zoom out a little bit. And that requires some awareness of yourself and a desire to learn more. Above discernment, that's the level of discernment, above discernment, you can begin to make wise decisions. And then there's a 6th level and a 7th level, which brings you into God's presence, and He's part of you as you live your life. So each of us has to search for what we're going to do with our lives and make decisions about how we're going to live our life. And if we reflect on those and discern what's the better choice I'm about to make, and pause a little bit, then you might actually get a message. This might be better for you. And that's the kind of things I learned, and that's how we raised our kids. That's what I found very useful. My purpose was just to always make the best decisions I could, which may not have anything to do with ego or my career or whatever, but it has to do with a higher level of consciousness so that I'm serving the community or something like that.
Next question.
Thank you guys for taking time.
I'd like to direct this question to Tim. Tim, I believe you said that. Okay. I believe you said that there's a part of our being that doesn't change. Now, in spiritual ideology, that's called the self. The self is unchanging. It's the one thing that doesn't change. I'd like to know what Buddhism thinks about a self, an unchanging part of our being. Does it really teach that?
Yeah, just really quickly, that question is what made the Buddha a Buddhist. Because much of Buddhist philosophy, anyway, is a critique about the Hindu idea of Atman, of soul.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit of a geeky description, but the point of what we would call our basic being, we don't use the word self. Self is transitory and changing in Buddhist lexicon. We would say that there's a fundamental essence, a fundamental nature of our being that doesn't change, that we can't put our finger on it, we can't find it, it's unfindable, and yet it's unstoppable.
And what do they call that? What's the name for it?
The all ground, the ontologic, the grounded being we would use, all of these, there's dozens and dozens of words, our Buddha nature, our wisdom nature, our pristine nature. But the point is that although it's constantly expressing itself in experience and thoughts and emotions, it itself cannot be found. So we can't find it, we can't stop it. So that's the part that never changes, and the reason that it doesn't change is quite, it's like the space in this room. The analogy is like the space in this room. The space isn't made up of anything, and therefore it's not a conditioned phenomenon. It's not made up of something that then one piece could change, so it changes. It's like space, it's never changing.
It's a hard thing to comprehend because,
yes, it's
after all, Buddha said,
a couple thousand years.
Buddha said we reincarnate. So there's something that's
What reincarnates is our
reincarnating,
confusion.
that there's something that
That's
karma
right.
is attached to.
That's right, it's confusion.
And, yeah, okay.
It's confusion.
Well, we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's what gets reborn. It'd be nice to think that our pristine self gets reborn, but actually we get reborn because we haven't recognized that self that doesn't change. And we hold on to things that do appear bright and shiny and that change. And that causes karma, and that karma causes rebirth.
But we is the
Tim
problem.
said-
We.
Huh?
You say we.
Yeah, so there is something that we call us, me, that's transitory, that's changing, that's composite. So we have no problem with that self. A capital self as an unchanging, as an Atman, that's our own. That's our
Jim, I have a quick question for you. So this whole topic is about identity.
Yeah.
So following up on what you just said, would you say from a Buddhist perspective that we all share the same one identity?
This is in Buddhist philosophy. This is the trees in the forest question. You know where I'm going with this. If we can't find one tree, in other words, we can't find the essence, this thing here that I call self, we can't talk about a conglomeration of selves. So again, as a critique of Hindu philosophy, we would say there's no such thing as sort of cosmic consciousness. Although we do get very, very close. Buddhists like to mince words, but we don't attribute some sort of pool of being that we're a part of. We don't do that. We come close, but we don't really do it.
So do we all have separate identities?
We have separate seeming identities. That's the distinction. Sometimes in Buddhist philosophy, the distinction is between absolute truth and relative truth. Relative truth is how I look from, as a father or a son or on Monday or Tuesday. The changing part, the part that seems like me, but the authentic me, that never changes.
Not very Jungian.
Really?
Yeah, could you come up to the mic, please? Yeah.
I think everyone can hear me.
Actually, it'd be better if you come to the mic, really.
Thanks.
You wanna-
Thank
Don't
you.
be afraid of the mic.
Karen, I'm not familiar with Course in Miracles. I'd like to just hear if you could explain that and how it relates. I have no idea what that is.
How it relates or just what it is?
Well, I guess what it is and maybe how it relates to what we're discussing.
Okay, A Course in Miracles is a book that was channeled starting in about 1966 by the head of the psychology department at Columbia University. She, being the first female head of the psychology department and being Jewish, even though the book seems to be in Christian terms, wanted nothing to do with it. But it took 7 years of channeling. And then her department head, after it was all done, helped her punctuate it. So it was one long run-on sentence. And it took a lot of prayer and a lot of focus to try to figure out how to punctuate it. And that was all it was done. It was published by called the Foundation for Inner Peace, that only charged what it cost to put the book together. And then the people that had anything to do with the book stepped back. And the book says it's not a belief system, it's actually a way to unwind your belief system and get away from the little self back to an experience. It says there will never be a universal theology because different time and different culture teaches different ways, but there needs to be a universal experience of that aha moment. And what it tries to do is remove the things that might limit you from that belief. And so why it's called A Course in Miracles is that they said the closer we get to our true nature, the more we're living within the miraculous. It's not that we can perform miracles. They said not to do that, that would be egoic. But how do you live in a state of awe? And so as you take away the learning of the world, the identity that we're talking about, the closer you get to non-attachment and be able to live in fully present in the now, because we're not worried about the future or feeling guilty about the past. And that is the whole focus of A Course in Miracles.
And I would ask you, how do you define yourself? How do people who are taking the course or involved in the course, how do they define themselves? Who are they?
They don't define themselves. In fact,
How did you get on this panel?
because I've been leading the group, it's a spiritual leader. But no, we don't have any labels for ourselves. People come that are Buddhists, that are American Indian, I mean, of all walks
No,
of
but
life.
I'm talking about what we're talking about. How do you know who you are?
It's an experience. It isn't intellectual. There are no symbols. It is, the miraculous is an experience. It's like saying, who knows what the experience of awe is? And if you've experienced awe, and I think everybody has, you can't really put it into words, but you can say, I know it, and that's what the course, that's its whole focus, is how do you know that inner experience? How do you drop the outer identification and live within the longing? I mean, everything that all of you talk about, from Ernest's longing for God and everything else, would be the way I describe it. It just doesn't come with labels.
I'm really confused.
Now you're getting somewhere.
And I think that's probably why it spoke to me after my near-death experience, because that's an experience, and it's not something that happens that you learn.
It is a
It's mystical, it's wonderful.
Next question, yeah, did you have?
It's supposed to be from Jesus, though, right? The
Yes.
channeling is from Jesus.
Yeah, but everybody who's fundamental Christian thinks it's Buddhist.
I think we had a good question in the back there. Come on up.
This question kind of goes back. This question goes back to kind of what you said at the beginning, and also links up with what you just said. But I'm curious from all of your different perspectives, and I really liked your analogy with the instruments, with the middle C. And it sounds like you've all been through, a lot in your own faith journeys in terms of determining where you fit and often leaving other religions to go and find that. And my question is, through that experience, how closely, obviously many of you have come to a specific identity, like a word, a tradition. It sounds like you haven't. And so you maybe have already answered my question, but how do you, how like tightly or how loosely do you hold to those definitions of yourself with your faith tradition, personally and also in relation to other people? And if that's a confusing question, I can.
One of the things I've found, and we've talked about over the years, is I think that people in the formative phase of their spiritual life, in the searching phase, which could go on for decades and decades, I think people usually identify themselves as I am not. They go through, in the beginning, as we were saying, they sort of are born into something and it works. And then when something cracks, then for years, I'm not that, I don't believe in this, I'm spiritual, not religious, I don't want to have an identity, I don't. And then that falls away. And it just seems like when you really develop some kind of basic sort of comfort in your own skin, spiritually, you become fascinated by and completely willing to allow people to be comfortable in their own skin. And that's what you share, is the appreciation and the satisfaction and the joy. And the fact that one person is this or one person is that just makes it spicy. But you sort of come back together, as it were. And it's really a beautiful process, it seems like.
And I think it's one begins to treat and see everybody, treat everybody the same way. You don't have a different set of reactions. You don't have a different set of the way you see people. You don't have a different set for each person. You just open to that person. You listen to them. You may agree or may not agree, but the idea is you're accepting what they have to say. You're listening to them, and you're treating everybody the same way, whether they have in that approach. When you meet them, when you listen to them, you're making them, I think, feel important because you are listening to them. And at least for me, that's very important, and that's something I carry with me. Is that it's my approach to people. It's whoever they are. It doesn't change. It doesn't change because they have a different political agenda, or they look different, or they don't agree with me. But my approach to them is always the same, and that's part of who I am. And I don't know how else to explain that.
I'm not quite sure how I'm going to explain this, but what I have learned is that the only person that I need to monitor and evaluate is myself. So what I find everybody interesting, and when I listen, what I have learned to do is to listen. And when I listen, I don't engage the ego or any of the lower elements. I always try to listen with as much compassion and empathy and understanding as I can possibly muster. And then I feel connected almost to any person I'm listening to. And that to me is one of the major values of my age, of trying to do this more and more, because it's not up to me to judge another person. It's up to me to listen to them and to find out what their questions are, and if I can help them figure out how to answer their questions. And that does build relationships, and it builds unity, it builds respect, and that also is what builds a community. That's one of the many things I like about Steamboat, by the way.
I think religion can help build a sense of belonging and identity and strength and confidence and peace and all that kind of good stuff. But then after a while, like Tim was saying, you get to a point where you need to go through a threshold, or you need to, there was a question about the endoskin and the exoskeleton, and exoskeleton anyway, which we didn't get to, but something about how getting to the point where you break out of that exoskeleton to kind of keep growing on the inside. Sometimes the structures get in the way, and we sort of outgrow those structures. I think the community is good and helpful within a certain religion. And I came across a quote recently from a Christian perspective that says that you're not really an authentic Christian until you can see Christ in everyone. Interesting idea. Replace the word Christ with whatever, divinity, holiness, whatever. But so I think authentic religion should open us up to seeing the divine and the holy, God's presence in everyone, and recognizing the connections there. And I think what prevents us from doing that, I think, is insecurity. Like, I'm here for my own security, and I need to define myself against everyone else so that I feel good about myself. It's from an insecure place. Hopefully religion can get us strong enough and secure enough and trusting enough that we can begin to look and see goodness in other people as well, and respect their freedom to choose whatever path they're choosing to access, hopefully, the same holy presence.
If you come back to the book, which is what I thought this discussion was about. If you come back to the book, this girl had a great identity of herself based on what she thought she came from as far as her heredity. And even though she didn't look like her sisters, people told her that she didn't look like she belonged in the family. But she had this identity that she believed in. As soon as she found that she was only a half-sister to her sister.
No, not a sister at all.
She was a half-sister, the mother was the same.
No.
Spoiler alert.
She had a half-sister by her father, but when she found out her father wasn't her father, that was not a sister at all.
She's somebody's half sister.
Well, okay, but the point is that her entire identity, as far as she was concerned, was what she thought was her heredity.
Right.
when she found out that this wasn't her heredity, what I found disturbing in this is that she didn't believe in what she thought her heredity was. And now that she found that, and the accident where she finds who her actual father is, and her appearance makes it reasonable to her that she then is not what she thought she was, but she is the daughter of this doctor in Portland, Oregon. That she sheds her entire identity and takes on the identity of this doctor in Portland, Oregon. At the end, she makes a balance of the two. But the question that I thought I was going to hear discussed tonight is it the heredity, the fact that she had generations of Orthodox Jews that she thought were her ancestors, and when she found that wasn't true, that she thought she was somebody different. So is it the heredity, or is it the environment that is making her who she is, making us who we are? And that's, you started with that, and then I think you kind of got away from that. So I'm not sure that I have a question, but it's a comment.
Well, that's a good question.
No, I think you are asking a question. And if you think about what she talked about throughout the book was the biological and the social. So the people who find that they've got fathers that are sperm donors talk about their social father and their biological father. And I think the fact that she started the book with that bit of looking in the mirror, that she always had a doubt. So I didn't read it as she threw it all away, but that in finding and finally accepting that she may have a different biological father than her social father, that really compelled the search that had kind of been unconsciously there the whole time. And she really wanted to know who was this face looking back at her, which I have heard when I've worked with children who were adopted or anything else, is who am I really? Whose face am I looking at? And so that really compelled her. So that would be, and by the end of the book, she had come back to, yes, I am this other. I mean, her mother was Jewish. Yes, I am this culture. Yes, I am my hereditary. I am this, my social father is my father. But I also have an answer to whose face is looking back in the mirror. Who made me up? And she really addressed to me both of those questions. And that's in my early answer what I'm saying is that we have both of those things. We have an innate inside thing, and we have the influence of the environment around. That influence of the environment around can be the most effective thing for her life. That defined her Jewishness, her family, her son, her father, her mother. But then there's also this other part that is informative.
I think through the book, she's extremely angry at her mother, and had she not been so angry at her mother, it might have changed her whole search. She was so angry at her parent. She had disbelief about what really happened at her conception. She took it in an entirely different direction. Had she had a different relationship with her mother, she probably never would have gone in that direction. So I think your question is good, and I think the answer is both, is that they both have a tremendous effect on who we are.
We can talk about our biological father, we can talk about our social father, we could also talk about our spiritual father. And I just am reminded of one little scene in the Gospels where Jesus is surrounded by a bunch of people and he's talking to them, and he gets word from some messenger coming in and says, your mother and your brothers are out there and they're looking for you. They want to talk to you. And he looks around at the crowd and he says, who are my mother and my brothers? Anyone who hears the word of God and obeys it is my mother and sister and brother. Perhaps that can apply to all of our traditions in terms of hearing the Spirit, hearing God, hearing the divine, and just obeying. We're all part of the same family. That's our spiritual identity.
So I think we'll wrap up at this point. Just a couple of things. If you'd like to be on our email list, we only send emails about our events. And like I said, we offer panels on various topics a couple of times a year. There's a sign-up sheet in the back. We also have some surveys there if you would like to fill out a survey. And at the bottom, there's a place where you can suggest topics for future events if there's something you'd like the panel to talk about. We meet once a month and discuss various things, and then once we think we have something that might be interesting, we do a public forum on that. We have a donation jar if anyone would like to make a donation that just supports us putting on these events. I forgot to mention, but we actually have live streamed this event tonight on Facebook, so you're welcome to watch it again, or if you wanted to share it with anybody, or continue the discussion, you can do that at Exploring the Sacred on Facebook.
Are you going to get a website?
Yes, and pretty soon we are going to join the 19th century, or even the 20th century, and have a website. So that should be coming here in the next month or two. It'll be exploringthesacred.com. And I think that's it. Thanks so much to Jenny Lane, the library, for hosting this event.
And we should thank all of you for your thoughtful questions, too.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I accepted. In fact, I came here to get it. It was out. It was out.